What would you do if one flight revealed the truth about who you are, not just to others, but to yourself? On a routine journey aboard a private jet, the dynamics of power, respect, and assumptions collide in unexpected ways. Evelyn Carter, a poised and unassuming woman, boards her own airline under the radar. But what starts as a quiet flight quickly turns turbulent, not because of the skies, but because of the biases she confronts. A flight attendant with a rigid sense of order, a team struggling with change, passengers who don't know they're in the presence of someone extraordinary. As tensions rise, Evelyn's hidden identity is revealed, sending shockwaves through the cabin and beyond. This is a story about leadership under pressure, the courage to challenge prejudice, and the transformative power of respect. But as Evelyn implements a bold initiative to reshape her airline's culture, resistance brews behind the scenes. Can she turn skeptics into allies and prove that respect is more than a policy, it's a way forward? The private jet gleamed under the afternoon sun, a symbol of luxury and exclusivity. Inside, plush leather seats and soft ambient music set the stage for an elegant journey. The passengers, a mix of business magnates and social elites, settled into their seats with practiced ease. Among them was Evelyn Carter, a composed woman in her early 40s, dressed in tailored white blouse and navy slacks. Her demeanor exuded quiet confidence, yet she made no effort to draw attention to herself. Evelyn moved with purpose, her leather tote tucked neatly under her arm as she took her seat near the front of the cabin. Though her presence was understated, it was impossible to ignore the quiet authority she carried. Her expression, calm and composed, made her seem as though she had nothing to prove. At the entrance, Lauren Mitchell, the lead flight attendant, greeted each passenger with a smile that varied in warmth, depending on the recipient. Her sharp, tailored uniform and perfectly styled hair reflected her obsession with order and appearances. But Lauren's charm turned icy as she reached Evelyn. "Welcome aboard," Lauren said curtly, her tone devoid of the warmth she reserved for other passengers. Evelyn nodded politely, saying nothing as she took her seat. Behind her, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, a retired couple, exchanged pleasantries with Lauren, receiving a much warmer greeting. Evelyn noticed but remained silent, her gaze briefly flicking to the Andersons before she opened a book and began reading. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Lauren walked through the cabin, ensuring everything was in place. Her eyes lingered on Evelyn's tote bag, neatly placed beneath her seat. Something about Evelyn unsettled her, not her attire, which was impeccably professional, but her air of unshakable calm. "Excuse me," Lauren said, stopping by Evelyn's seat. "I believe you're in the wrong section." Evelyn looked up, her expression serene. "This is my seat," she replied simply. Lauren's lips tightened. "This area is reserved for elite passengers," she said, her voice dropping but not her condescension. Evelyn met Lauren's gaze, unflinching. "You might want to check the passenger list," she said softly. Nearby, passengers perked up, sensing the tension. A man in a crisp business suit frowned slightly, while a socialite in oversized sunglasses leaned toward her companion, whispering something. Lauren's tone sharpened. "I don't need to check. I know who belongs here." Evelyn closed her book and placed it gently on her lap. "Then perhaps you should call someone who does." Lauren's irritation was palpable, but she straightened, unwilling to back down. She gestured to Grace, a younger flight attendant standing nearby. "Escort her to the back," Lauren ordered. Grace hesitated, glancing between Evelyn and Lauren. "Maybe we should." "Now, Grace," Lauren snapped. The tension in the cabin thickened as Grace reluctantly stepped forward. But before she could speak, Evelyn's calm voice cut through the air. "You're making a mistake," she said, her tone quiet but firm. Lauren scoffed. "And why's that?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "Because I don't just belong here," she said, her voice unwavering. "This plane belongs to me." The words sent a ripple of whispers through the cabin, but Lauren merely smirked. "Nice try," she said. "Now move." Evelyn leaned back, crossing her arms with an air of quiet defiance. "Call the pilot," she said. Lauren faltered for the briefest moment, then turned sharply toward the cockpit. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward, his curiosity clearly piqued. "Do you think she's serious?" he whispered to his seatmate. The socialite adjusted her sunglasses. "I don't know," she murmured, "but she's not backing down." The cockpit door opened, and the pilot stepped into the cabin, his expression neutral but tense. He approached Lauren and spoke in hushed tones. Her confident facade faltered as he gestured toward Evelyn. Lauren's voice rose, tinged with disbelief. "That's impossible." The pilot's reply was calm but firm. "It's not. She's Evelyn Carter, the owner of this aircraft and one of the airline's principal investors." The cabin fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over the passengers like a heavy blanket. Evelyn remained seated, her posture as calm as ever, though her gaze held a new sharpness as it met Lauren's. Lauren's face turned pale, her words stammering as she tried to recover. I didn't know." "You didn't care to know," Evelyn interrupted, her voice as steady as it was cutting. The pilot turned to Lauren, his tone clipped. "Ms. Mitchell, I'll handle this from here." As Lauren stepped back, visibly shaken, the businessman across the aisle broke the silence with a quiet chuckle. "I guess we're in for an interesting flight." Evelyn opened her book again, her demeanor unbothered. But as the plane ascended, the tension in the cabin hinted that this was only the beginning. The cabin buzzed with murmurs as passengers exchanged glances, their shock at Evelyn Carter's revelation palpable. Lauren stood at the galley, gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. Her mind raced, replaying the events leading up to this moment. How had she not recognized Evelyn? And more importantly, what would happen now? Meanwhile, Evelyn sat quietly in her seat, her book opens once again. The tension in the air didn't seem to faze her. She turned a page calmly, her focus unwavering despite the commotion around her. Across the aisle, the businessman, a middle-aged man named Andrew Grant, watched her with a mix of curiosity and admiration. "Miss Carter," he said softly, leaning slightly forward. Evelyn looked up, her expression calm but attentive. "I hope I'm not intruding," Andrew continued, his tone polite. "But may I just say, the way you handled that was impressive." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Evelyn's lips. "Thank you, Mr. Grant." "Andrew Grant," he said, extending his hand. Evelyn shook it briefly, her grip firm but unassuming. "Forgive me for asking," Andrew said cautiously, "but why keep your identity hidden? Someone in your position doesn't need to prove anything to anyone." Evelyn's gaze shifted, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it's not about proving anything," she replied. "It's about understanding what happens when people think you have nothing to prove." Andrew nodded slowly, as if turning her words over in his mind. Behind them, Grace, the junior flight attendant, lingered by the service station. She glanced nervously at Lauren, who was still rooted in place, her face a mask of uncertainty. Summoning her courage, Grace approached Evelyn cautiously. "Miss Carter," Grace said, her voice tentative. Evelyn looked up, her expression softening slightly. "Yes?" "I just wanted to say," Grace began, wringing her hands, I'm sorry for how things were handled earlier. I should have spoken up." Evelyn studied Grace for a moment, her gaze steady, but not unkind. "It's never easy to stand up when you're afraid of the consequences," she said gently. "But doing the right thing is rarely easy." Grace nodded, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "Thank you," she whispered. Their exchange didn't go unnoticed. Lauren, still watching from the galley, felt her stomach twist. Grace's apology was a subtle but clear condemnation of her actions. And though Lauren wanted to justify her behavior, she couldn't ignore the weight of Evelyn's quiet authority. Moments later, the pilot returned to the cabin. His steps were brisk, his expression unreadable as he approached Evelyn. "Miss Carter," he said respectfully, "everything has been arranged as you requested. Is there anything else I can do for you?" Evelyn set her book aside, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Not at the moment. Thank you, Captain," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. The pilot nodded and excused himself, disappearing back into the cockpit. The exchange left the passengers even more curious. What had been arranged? And why did Evelyn's presence seem to command such immediate action? As the flight settled into a quieter rhythm, Lauren finally worked up the nerve to approach Evelyn. She smoothed her uniform and steadied her breathing, determined to salvage what little dignity she had left. "Miss Carter," Lauren began, her tone measured but strained. Evelyn looked up, her expression neutral. "I want to apologize for earlier," Lauren said, forcing herself to meet Evelyn's gaze. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry." The cabin grew quieter as passengers subtly leaned closer, eager to witness the interaction. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing but not hostile. "Apologies are a start," she said calmly, "but they're only meaningful when paired with action." Lauren hesitated, her composure wavering. "I understand," she said softly. "If there's anything I can do to make this right—" Evelyn held up a hand, stopping her. "The best way to make this right," she said firmly, "is to learn from it. Treat every passenger with respect, regardless of who you think they are." Lauren nodded, her cheeks burning with humiliation. "I will," she said quietly. Evelyn's gaze softened slightly. "Good," she said simply, returning to her book. Lauren stepped back, unsure whether she felt relief or dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that this incident would have lasting repercussions. At the rear of the cabin, Grace approached Andrew, who was now scrolling through his phone. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "I was wondering, you seemed to know something about Miss Carter earlier. How?" Andrew smiled faintly. "Let's just say I keep up with industry news," he replied. "Evelyn Carter isn't just the owner of this airline. She's also one of the most influential leaders in aviation. Her name carries weight for a reason." Grace's eyes widened. "I had no idea," she murmured. Andrew chuckled softly. "Most people wouldn't. She prefers to let her actions speak for her." As the plane cruised at altitude, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. Passengers, now aware of Evelyn's true identity, regarded her with newfound respect. Even the nosy socialite seemed to shrink into her seat, avoiding eye contact with Evelyn entirely. But Evelyn remained as composed as ever, her focus unbroken as she turned another page of her book. Though the tension had eased, there was a sense that the true test of the flight was yet to come. The cabin's earlier tension had softened, but curiosity hung in the air like an unspoken question. Evelyn Carter continued reading, unbothered by the occasional glances cast her way. Her calm demeanor only deepened the passengers' intrigue. At the rear of the plane, Grace lingered near the service station, replaying her earlier conversation with Evelyn. The woman's quiet strength left an impression Grace couldn't shake. For the first time since joining the airline, she felt a pang of doubt about her ability to navigate the complexities of human interaction under pressure. Andrew Grant, seated a few rows behind Evelyn, leaned back in his chair. He observed the younger flight attendant's troubled expression with quiet curiosity before deciding to act. Rising from his seat, he approached the service area, giving Grace a polite smile. "Miss," he began, his voice steady and kind, "you seem a bit lost in thought. Everything all right?" Grace blinked, startled by his directness, but nodded quickly. "Oh yes," she said hurriedly. "Just processing, I suppose." Andrew chuckled softly. "Evelyn Carter has that effect on people," he said. Grace glanced toward Evelyn, her admiration evident. "She's incredible. I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that with so much grace." "She's had to," Andrew said, his tone laced with meaning. The higher you climb, the more people want to tear you down. Evelyn knows how to navigate those moments and turn them into opportunities. Grace frowned slightly. But how does someone learn that? I mean, what makes her so unshakable? Andrew leaned closer, lowering his voice. You don't get to where Evelyn is without understanding two things: power and patience. She doesn't react rashly because she doesn't need to. People reveal their true colors when they think you're powerless, and Evelyn knows how to use that to her advantage. Grace absorbed his words, her respect for Evelyn deepening. Up front, Lauren stood near the galley, fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. Though she had apologized to Evelyn, the weight of her misjudgment lingered. Every glance from a passenger felt like an accusation, every whisper a reminder of her failure. As she wrestled with her thoughts, a voice startled her. "You're Lauren, right?" Lauren turned to find a man in his late 40s standing nearby. His tailored suit and confident posture suggested he wasn't just another passenger. He extended a hand with a faint smile. "Robert Sinclair," he introduced himself. "I work with Miss Carter." Lauren's heart sank. I didn't realize she had company." Robert chuckled lightly. "That's the point. Evelyn likes to keep a low profile, even when she travels for business. She believes actions speak louder than status." Lauren nodded stiffly, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I wanted to talk to you," Robert continued, his tone measured but firm. "It's clear this has been a difficult flight for you, but I have to ask, why didn't you check the passenger list before confronting her?" Lauren's cheeks burned. I didn't think it was necessary," she admitted. "She didn't look like the type who—" Robert raised an eyebrow. "The type who belongs here?" He finished for her. Lauren flinched at his words, but nodded reluctantly. "I made assumptions," she said quietly. "And those assumptions nearly cost you," Robert said, his voice sharpening. "Not just your job, but your integrity. If Evelyn hadn't been as composed as she is, this could have escalated much further." Lauren swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "I know," she said softly. "I'm sorry. I never meant to—" "To what?" Robert interrupted. "Judge someone based on appearances. That's not an accident, Lauren. That's a choice. And if you want to recover from this, you'll need to make better ones moving forward." Lauren looked away, ashamed, but grateful for his honesty. "I'll do better," she promised. "I hope so," Robert said, "because Evelyn believes in giving people chances, but she doesn't give them lightly." Meanwhile, Evelyn set her book down as Robert approached her seat. He greeted her with a respectful nod, then leaned closer to speak softly. "Everything is ready, Miss Carter," he said. "We've confirmed the arrangements for the meeting." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you, Robert. And the cabin?" Robert glanced toward the rear of the plane, where Grace was now speaking with Andrew. "Grace shows promise," he said. "Lauren has some work to do." Evelyn's gaze followed his, her expression thoughtful. "Keep an eye on both of them," she said. "I want to see how they handle the rest of the flight." Robert nodded. "Of course." As he returned to his seat, Evelyn leaned back and gazed out the window. Though she maintained her calm exterior, her mind was busy. This flight wasn't just another journey, it was a test. And not just for the crew. Back at the service station, Grace felt a newfound determination building within her. Andrew's words had planted a seed of courage, and she resolved to prove herself not just to Evelyn, but to herself. She approached Lauren, her voice steady but kind. "Hey," she began. Lauren turned, her expression wary. "What is it?" "I think we can do better," Grace said simply. "For the passengers and for ourselves." Lauren hesitated, surprised by Grace's confidence. For the first time, she saw her younger colleague not as a subordinate, but as an equal. "Yeah," Lauren said finally, her voice softening. "We can." As the two flight attendants exchanged a tentative smile, The plane hummed steadily through the clouds. Unseen by most, Evelyn watched the exchange with quiet approval. Evelyn Carter's gaze lingered on Lauren and Grace as they exchanged a tentative smile near the service station. She could see the shift in their dynamic, a subtle but significant thawing of tension. Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her expression calm but pensive. This wasn't just about correcting an incident, it was about laying the groundwork for something greater. Across the aisle, Andrew Grant watched the scene with quiet amusement. He leaned toward Evelyn, lowering his voice to a conversational tone. "They seem to be learning," he said, his words carrying a note of approval. Evelyn gave a small nod. "Growth takes time," she replied, her tone measured. "But it always starts with awareness." Andrew chuckled softly. "You certainly have a talent for fostering that. Mind if I ask why you chose to handle things this way?" Evelyn turned to him, her gaze steady. "Because leadership isn't about dominance," she said. "It's about influence. People don't change when you force them. They change when you inspire them." Andrew leaned back thoughtfully, nodding to himself. At the service station, Grace stepped forward, glancing at Lauren with renewed determination. "Let's review the passenger list again," she suggested. Lauren raised an eyebrow but didn't protest. She retrieved the list from its clip near the cockpit and laid it on the counter. Together they scanned the names, double-checking seat assignments and preferences. As they worked, Grace broke the silence. "Can I say something?" Lauren hesitated but nodded. "I think what happened earlier was a wake-up call," Grace said carefully. "For both of us. It's easy to get caught up in routines and forget that every passenger has a story we don't know." Lauren's expression softened slightly. "You're right," she admitted. "I've been doing this job long enough to know better. I let my assumptions get in the way." Grace offered a small smile. "At least we can learn from it. And maybe support each other better moving forward?" Lauren met her gaze and nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." Meanwhile, Robert Sinclair approached Evelyn again, his demeanor as calm and professional as ever. He leaned in, speaking in a low tone. "I've just spoken with the ground team," he said. "They're ready for your review when we land." Evelyn nodded. "Good. And the preparations for the announcement?" "On schedule," Robert confirmed. "The team is coordinating the rollout across all departments." Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile. "Excellent." Before Robert could return to his seat, Evelyn gestured for him to wait. "One more thing," she said. "Keep an eye on Lauren and Grace. I want to see how they handle the rest of the flight." Robert nodded. "Understood." As the plane cruised at altitude, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. Passengers who had earlier been spectators to the tension now relaxed into quiet conversations, though their curiosity about Evelyn lingered. Lauren and Grace, now working as a cohesive team, moved through the cabin with renewed energy. Their professionalism didn't go unnoticed. When Lauren paused to refill a passenger's drink, she was met with a warm smile. "Thank you," the passenger said. "It's nice to see things running smoothly." Lauren managed a small smile in return. "I appreciate that," she said sincerely. At the same time, Grace attended to an elderly couple near the back. The woman struggled to adjust her blanket, and Grace stepped in immediately. "Here, let me help," she said, gently tucking the blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you, dear," the woman said with a grateful smile. These small moments, unnoticed by most, did not escape Evelyn's attention. She observed quietly, her expression giving away nothing. Near the midpoint of the flight, Evelyn rose from her seat. The cabin grew noticeably quieter as passengers turned to watch her, their curiosity reignited. She walked with measured grace toward the service station, where Lauren and Grace were tidying up. "Miss Carter," Lauren said, straightening nervously. Evelyn regarded her for a moment, then spoke calmly. "May I have a word?" Lauren nodded quickly, following Evelyn to a quieter corner of the cabin. Grace watched from a distance, her anxiety evident. Evelyn's voice remained even as she addressed Lauren. "You've made progress today," she began. "But tell me, what have you learned?" Lauren hesitated, caught off guard by the direct question. "I've learned not to judge passengers based on appearances," she said slowly. Evelyn nodded. "That's a start," she said. "But leadership isn't just about correcting mistakes. It's about setting a standard one that others can look to and follow. Do you think you're capable of that?" Lauren swallowed hard. "I'd like to be," she admitted. Evelyn studied her for a moment, then offered a small smile. "Then prove it," she said simply. As Evelyn turned to leave, she caught Grace's eye and gestured for her to join. Grace hurried over, her heart pounding. "You've shown promise today," Evelyn said, her tone warm but firm. "I see potential in you, but potential means nothing without action. Are you ready to step up?" Grace nodded, her determination evident. "Yes, Miss Carter, I am." Evelyn's smile widened slightly. "Good, because the two of you will need to work together if you want to succeed not just on this flight, but in the future." With that, she returned to her seat, leaving both Lauren and Grace with a renewed sense of purpose. As the plane continued its journey, the passengers settled into a relaxed rhythm. But for Lauren and Grace, the stakes felt higher than ever. They worked in sync, driven by the silent encouragement of the woman who had quietly reshaped their perspectives. Evelyn, watching from her seat, allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. The real test, she knew, would come after the plane landed. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the private jet descended toward its destination. Evelyn Carter sat quietly by the window, her expression unreadable. Outside, the sprawling city skyline came into view, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over its towering buildings. In the galley, Lauren and Grace worked efficiently, their earlier tensions replaced with a shared sense of responsibility. They exchanged occasional glances, an unspoken understanding growing between them. Evelyn's words lingered in their minds. Leadership is about setting a standard. The intercom crackled to life, and the pilot's voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your belongings are secured." Evelyn closed her book and placed it neatly on the armrest. As the plane's wheels touched down, a ripple of anticipation coursed through the passengers. Evelyn's calm presence had set the tone for the flight, but everyone sensed that something significant was about to unfold. After the jet came to a smooth stop on the tarmac, Evelyn stood, her movements deliberate and graceful. The passengers watched as she adjusted her blazer and stepped toward the exit. Lauren and Grace stood at the front of the cabin, their postures stiff with nervous anticipation. Evelyn stopped before them, her gaze steady. "Good work today," she said simply, her words carrying weight. Lauren blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Miss Carter," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Grace nodded quickly. "It was an honor to serve you," she added. Evelyn allowed a faint smile. "Remember what you've learned," she said. "It's not just about doing your job, it's about how you do it." With that, Evelyn stepped off the plane, her heels clicking softly against the stairs as she descended to the tarmac. A sleek black SUV waited nearby, its driver standing at attention. As Evelyn approached the vehicle, Robert Sinclair emerged from the airport terminal, his phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call quickly and greeted Evelyn with a nod. "Everything is ready, Miss Carter," he said, falling into step beside her. "Good," Evelyn replied. "The press?" "They've been briefed," Robert confirmed, "and the team is waiting in the conference room." Evelyn's expression remained calm, but there was a glint of resolve in her eyes. "Let's not keep them waiting," she said. Inside the airport, a private conference room buzzed with quiet activity. Executives and department heads from Evelyn's airline were seated around a polished table, their conversations hushed. At the front of the room, a podium stood ready, flanked by a projector screen displaying the airline's logo. When Evelyn entered, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to her as she walked to the podium with the same quiet confidence she had displayed on the plane. Robert took a seat near the back, his presence a silent reassurance. Evelyn surveyed the room briefly before speaking. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady and commanding. The executives leaned forward slightly, their attention rapt. "Over the past several months, we've made significant strides in modernizing our fleet, expanding our routes, and enhancing our customer experience," Evelyn continued. "But progress isn't just about innovation. It's about integrity. It's about creating an environment where every passenger and every employee feels valued." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Today's flight reminded me of the importance of that mission," she said, her tone sharpening. "When we make assumptions about who belongs, about who deserves respect, we undermine the very values we claim to uphold." The room was silent, her words hitting their mark. "To that end," Evelyn announced, "I'm implementing a new initiative across our airline. It's called Respect Above All. This program will focus on comprehensive training for our staff, emphasizing empathy, equity, and excellence in service. Because true success isn't measured by the luxury we provide, it's measured by the dignity with which we treat others." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. The executives exchanged nods, impressed by Evelyn's vision. Evelyn's gaze swept the room, her resolve evident. This isn't just a policy change, it's a cultural shift. And it starts with us. She stepped away from the podium, signaling the end of her address. The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing against the walls. Outside the conference room, Robert caught up with Evelyn as she exited. "That was impressive," he said, his tone warm but professional. Evelyn glanced at him, a faint smile on her lips. "It needed to be said," she replied. Robert nodded. "The team is ready to roll out the initiative. We'll ensure the messaging is consistent across all departments." "Good," Evelyn said. "And the crew from today's flight, keep an eye on them. I want to see how they grow." Robert's expression softened. "You saw potential in them?" Evelyn nodded. "Growth starts with awareness," she said, "and I believe they've taken the first step." Back at the private terminal, Lauren and Grace were tidying up the cabin. The silence between them was comfortable, their earlier tension replaced by a shared understanding. As Grace adjusted a seatbelt, she glanced at Lauren. "Do you think she meant it? That we did a good job?" Lauren paused, considering her words. "I think she saw that we were trying," she said. "And that we can do better." Grace nodded. "I want to prove her right," she said softly. Lauren smiled faintly. "Me too." The two women returned to their tasks, their movements more deliberate, their purpose clearer. As Evelyn's SUV pulled away from the terminal, she gazed out the window, her thoughts focused on the future. This was more than just another flight or another meeting. It was a reminder of the power of leadership, of how one moment, one decision, could ripple outward and inspire change. A week after the pivotal flight, Evelyn Carter's new initiative, Respect Above All, was officially launched. The announcement reverberated across the airline industry, drawing both praise and scrutiny. Media outlets covered the policy with headlines ranging from "Revolutionizing Customer Experience" to "A Bold Move Against Bias." Internally, the program's implementation was swift but challenging, as employees adjusted to the heightened expectations Evelyn had set. Evelyn, seated at the head of a long conference table in the airline's headquarters, listened intently as her leadership team delivered updates on the rollout. Robert Sinclair, her trusted advisor, stood beside her, briefing the room on initial feedback. "The response from passengers has been overwhelmingly positive," Robert began. "We've received dozens of emails and social media comments praising the changes. However," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, "some employees are struggling to adapt, particularly in high-pressure environments." Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. Change is never easy, she said, but it's necessary. What's being done to support them? Robert gestured to a woman seated at the far end of the table. Rebecca, our training director, has been spearheading workshops to help staff develop the skills needed for these new standards. She can provide more detail. Rebecca, a poised woman in her 40s, adjusted her glasses as she spoke. We've introduced scenario-based training to simulate real-world challenges, she explained. It's been effective for some, but others are resistant. They view the initiative as more of a critique than an opportunity. Evelyn's expression remained calm, though her eyes sharpened. Resistance often comes from fear of failure, she said. We need to show them that this isn't about punishment, it's about growth. Rebecca nodded. Understood, Miss Carter. We'll adjust the messaging to emphasize that. Meanwhile, at a bustling airport halfway across the country, Lauren Mitchell adjusted her uniform and took a deep breath. She had been assigned to a new flight, this time with Grace by her side. The two women had become unlikely allies since their last experience with Evelyn, bonding over their shared desire to improve. Grace caught Lauren's eye as they prepared for boarding. "Nervous?" she asked, her tone light but supportive. Lauren hesitated, then nodded. "A little," she admitted. "This is our first flight under the new initiative. Feels like there's a spotlight on us." Grace smiled. "That's not a bad thing. If anything, it's a chance to prove we've learned something." Lauren managed a small smile. "Let's hope so." As passengers began filing onto the plane, Lauren and Grace greeted them with genuine warmth. Their interactions were smooth and professional, a noticeable improvement from their earlier strained dynamics. Midway through the boarding process, a passenger in a wheelchair approached the gate. Lauren quickly stepped forward, her tone friendly. "Welcome aboard, sir. How can I assist you today?" The man, a veteran judging by the insignia on his jacket, smiled warmly. "Just need a hand getting settled," he said. Lauren nodded. "Of course. Grace, can you help with his carry-on?" Together, they ensured the passenger was comfortably seated. His gratitude was clear as he said, "You ladies are doing a great job. Haven't seen service like this in a while." Lauren felt a swell of pride, but kept her response humble. "Thank you, sir. We're glad to have you with us." Back at headquarters, Evelyn stood in her office, reviewing reports from various departments. Her assistant entered, carrying a stack of documents. "These just came in," the assistant said. "Customer satisfaction ratings for the week." Evelyn took the papers and scanned them quickly. The numbers were promising an uptick in positive feedback across the board, but one entry caught her eye, an anonymous comment from a flight attendant. "Change feels like a threat when you don't think you're good enough to meet expectations, but maybe this is the push I needed to believe I can do better." Evelyn smiled faintly, folding the paper and setting it aside. This was the impact she had hoped for, not just better service, but a shift in mindset. On Lauren and Grace's flight, turbulence struck midway through the journey. The sudden jolts sent passengers gripping their armrests, their murmurs of unease growing louder. Lauren quickly activated the intercom, her voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The captain is monitoring the situation and will update you shortly." Grace moved through the cabin, offering reassurance to nervous passengers. One young child began to cry, and Grace knelt by the family's seat, speaking gently until the child calmed down. When the turbulence subsided, the cabin erupted in relieved applause. Lauren and Grace exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of their teamwork. After the plane landed smoothly, passengers disembarked with smiles and words of thanks. The veteran stopped by Lauren and Grace on his way out, tipping his hat. "You both did great," he said. "Keep it up." Later that evening, as Lauren and Grace debriefed in the crew lounge, their supervisor approached with a small smile. "Miss Carter asked me to check in on your flight today," she said. "She'll be pleased to hear how well you handled everything." Lauren and Grace exchanged surprised looks. "Miss Carter's still watching?" Lauren asked. The supervisor nodded. "She believes in accountability and in recognizing growth. Don't be surprised if you hear from her directly." As the supervisor walked away, Grace grinned. "Looks like we're still part of her plan." Lauren laughed softly. "I can live with that." Back at headquarters, Evelyn sat at her desk, reviewing updates from the day. Robert entered, holding a tablet. "I thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing it over. On the screen was a video clip taken by a passenger on Lauren and Grace's flight, showing the two working seamlessly during the turbulence. The caption read, "Service with a smile, even in tough skies. Kudos to these attendants." Evelyn's smile widened slightly. "They're learning," she said. Robert nodded. "And they're proving your initiative works." Evelyn set the tablet aside, her gaze thoughtful. The winds of change had begun, and she was determined to see them through. Evelyn Carter's respect above all initiative had sparked widespread conversation within the airline. While many embraced the new direction, some employees weren't as eager to adapt. Behind closed doors and in quiet corners of airport terminals, whispers of discontent grew louder. In one such corner, a group of senior flight attendants gathered during a break. Their expressions were tight with frustration as they vented about the new policies. "This whole respect thing feels like a lecture," muttered Diane, a veteran with over 20 years of experience. "I've been doing this job longer than some of these trainers have been alive. I don't need a workshop to tell me how to treat passengers." Another attendant, Tom, nodded in agreement. "Exactly. They're acting like we've all been doing it wrong. Sure, we've had a few incidents, but that doesn't mean the entire staff needs a personality overhaul." A younger attendant, Mia, hesitated before speaking. "I don't know. I think it's a good change. It's not about saying we've been wrong, it's about making sure we're consistent," Diane scoffed. "That's easy for you to say. You haven't been here long enough to see how these things blow over. This is just another PR stunt to make the executives feel good." Mia frowned, but stayed quiet, feeling the weight of her colleagues' skepticism. Meanwhile, back at headquarters, Evelyn and Robert were reviewing an internal survey meant to gauge employee feedback on the initiative. "The numbers are mixed," Robert said, scrolling through the results on his tablet. "A solid 70% of staff support the program and sees its value. But there's a vocal minority, primarily longer-tenured employees, who feel targeted." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "Resistance is expected," she said. "Change challenges comfort zones, especially for those who've operated the same way for decades. The question is, how do we bring them on board?" Robert set the tablet down, his expression thoughtful. "We could host focus groups, give them a chance to air their concerns in a constructive way. It might help them feel heard." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Let's do it, and I want to be there." Robert raised an eyebrow. "You want to attend the focus groups personally?" "Yes," Evelyn replied firmly. "If we're asking them to meet this challenge head-on, the least I can do is meet them where they are." The first focus group was scheduled for the following week in a private meeting room at the airport. Evelyn entered quietly, her presence immediately drawing attention. Seated around the table were 10 flight attendants, a mix of seasoned veterans and newer hires. Diane and Tom were among the attendees, their skepticism evident in their crossed arms and tight expressions. Mia, the younger attendant, sat nervously, her gaze darting between Evelyn and her colleagues. "Good morning," Evelyn began, her tone calm but firm. "Thank you for taking the time to be here. I'm not here to lecture or impose, I'm here to listen." The group exchanged uncertain glances, caught off guard by her directness. "I understand that change can feel uncomfortable," Evelyn continued, "but I also believe that discomfort is where growth begins. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about creating a culture we can all be proud of. So, let's talk. What's on your mind? Diane was the first to speak, her tone measured but tinged with frustration. With all due respect, Miss Carter, many of us feel like this initiative paints us in a bad light, as if we haven't been doing our jobs well all these years. Evelyn nodded, her expression thoughtful. I can see how it might feel that way, she said. But let me ask you this. Do you think there's room for improvement? Diane hesitated. I suppose there's always room for improvement, but some of us feel like we're being asked to change who we are to fit a mold. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. What if I told you this isn't about changing who you are, but amplifying the best parts of what you already bring to the table? The room fell silent as the attendants processed her words. Tom finally spoke up. I think what bothers me most is that it feels impersonal, like it's just another corporate policy we're expected to follow without question. Evelyn nodded again. That's a valid concern, she said. And that's why I'm here to make it personal. This initiative isn't just about policies, it's about values. It's about creating an environment where every employee feels supported and every passenger feels valued. And that starts with trust. Mia, emboldened by Evelyn's approach, chimed in. I think the training has helped me see things differently. It's not just about how we handle passengers, it's about how we handle each other. Her comment earned a few nods from the group, though Diane and Tom remained skeptical. Evelyn smiled. Exactly. Respect isn't just a passenger-facing value, it's a team value, and it's something we all have to commit to, together. By the end of the session, the room felt lighter. While not all skepticism had been erased, the conversation had opened a door to understanding. Evelyn thanked the group for their honesty and encouraged them to share their thoughts openly moving forward. As the attendants filed out, Diane lingered for a moment. She approached Evelyn cautiously. Miss Carter, she began, her tone softer than before. I'll admit I was resistant to this at first, but you've given me something to think about. I just hope this isn't another flash-in-the-pan initiative. Evelyn met her gaze, her expression steady. Diane, I can promise you this. Respect above all isn't a campaign. It's a foundation, and it's here to stay. Diane nodded slowly, her skepticism giving way to a faint glimmer of hope. Back in her office later that day, Evelyn sat with Robert, reflecting on the session. What do you think? Robert asked. Evelyn's lips curved into a small smile. It's a start, she said. The hardest part of change isn't making the decision, it's sustaining the momentum. But I believe we're on the right path. Evelyn Carter's commitment to respect above all was starting to yield visible changes. Internal surveys showed a steady increase in staff engagement, and passenger satisfaction scores were higher than they'd been in years. But Evelyn knew that the true test of her initiative wasn't in the numbers. It was in the everyday decisions her employees made when no one was watching. At the airport, Diane sat at a corner table in the break room, scrolling through her phone. She wasn't one to linger, but something about Evelyn's words in the focus group had stayed with her. For the first time in years, Diane found herself questioning her own approach. Across the room, Mia hesitated before walking over with a cup of coffee. Mind if I join you? She asked. Diane glanced up, surprised, but gesturing to the seat across from her. Sure. Mia sat down, fidgeting with her cup. I wanted to thank you, she began. Diane frowned. For what? For speaking up in the meeting, Mia said. You said some things I think a lot of us were too scared to say. Diane raised an eyebrow, unsure if it was a compliment or a critique. And I think you were right, Mia said, her tone earnest. It does feel like a lot of change all at once. But I also think Evelyn's right. There's room for us to grow. Diane studied Mia for a moment, then sighed. You're braver than I was when I started out, she said. I used to believe in this job the way you do. Somewhere along the line, I just got tired. Mia nodded. I get that. But maybe this is our chance to believe in it again. Diane didn't respond right away, but her expression softened. Elsewhere, Lauren and Grace were preparing for another flight. The two had been paired together regularly since their pivotal flight with Evelyn, and their teamwork had only improved. "Have you noticed how different things feel?" Grace asked as they loaded supplies into the galley. Lauren glanced at her, curious. "Different how?" "I don't know," Grace said, shrugging. "Lighter. Like people are actually trying to be kinder?" Lauren chuckled. "It's amazing what a little accountability can do." As they worked, Tom passed by, pausing at the galley door. "You two look busy," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "We're getting ready for the rush," Lauren replied. Tom hesitated, then leaned against the doorframe. "I wanted to say, I saw how you handled that turbulence last week. You both did a great job." Grace blinked in surprise. "Thanks, Tom. That means a lot." Tom nodded, then added, "I still think some of this initiative stuff is over the top, but maybe it's not all bad." Lauren smiled faintly. "Baby steps, huh?" Tom smirked. "Something like that." Back at headquarters, Evelyn was reviewing updates in her office when Robert entered with a knowing look. "You're going to want to see this," he said, handing her a tablet. Evelyn took the device and scanned the screen. It was an internal newsletter featuring a story from a flight attendant who had recently attended one of the training workshops. The story detailed an interaction with a nervous passenger who had nearly missed their flight due to a misunderstanding at security. Instead of brushing the passenger off, the attendant took the time to listen, reassure them, and ensure they boarded safely. The article ended with the attendant writing, "This wasn't just about following the rules. It was about showing someone that they mattered. And for the first time in years, I felt proud of what I do." Evelyn smiled. "This is exactly what I hoped for." Robert nodded. "It's one story, but it's a start." Evelyn set the tablet down, her mind already racing. "We need to amplify this," she said. "Stories like this can inspire others to see the impact of their work." "I'll make sure it gets shared across the company," Robert said. "Good," Evelyn replied. "And keep me updated on the focus groups. I want to know if there's any progress with the skeptics." The next week, Diane found herself on a flight with Mia. As they prepared for takeoff, Diane noticed a passenger struggling to stow their oversized bag in the overhead compartment. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. "Let me help you with that," she said, her voice kind. The passenger smiled gratefully. "Thank you so much. I didn't think it would be this heavy." Diane lifted the bag with ease and secured it in the compartment. "No problem at all," she said. As she returned to the galley, Mia gave her a knowing look. "That was nice of you." Diane shrugged. "It's just part of the job." "Maybe," Mia said, "but it makes a difference." Diane didn't respond, but the faintest smile tugged at her lips. Later that evening, Diane sat in the crew lounge, scrolling through her phone. She stumbled across the internal newsletter featuring the story Evelyn had shared. As she read, something shifted in her perspective. She thought back to her own early days as a flight attendant, when she'd gone out of her way to make passengers feel welcome. Somewhere along the way, she had let fatigue and routine overshadow her passion for the job. Closing the article, Diane took a deep breath. Maybe it wasn't too late to reclaim that part of herself. Back in her office, Evelyn received another report from Robert. "Feedback from the focus groups is improving," he said. "Even some of the skeptics are starting to come around." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. "The tide is turning," she said. "Now, we just have to keep it going." Robert nodded. "What's next?" Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "Next, we show them how far this can take us." Evelyn Carter's commitment to respect above all was starting to yield visible changes. Internal surveys showed a steady increase in staff engagement, and passenger satisfaction scores were higher than they'd been in years. But Evelyn knew that the true test of her initiative wasn't in the numbers. It was in the everyday decisions her employees made when no one was watching. At the airport, Diane sat at a corner table in the break room, scrolling through her phone. She wasn't one to linger, but something about Evelyn's words in the focus group had stayed with her. For the first time in years, Diane found herself questioning her own approach. Across the room, Mia hesitated before walking over with a cup of coffee. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Diane glanced up, surprised, but gesturing to the seat across from her. "Sure." Mia sat down, fidgeting with her cup. "I wanted to thank you," she began. Diane frowned. "For what?" "For speaking up in the meeting," Mia said. "You said some things I think a lot of us were too scared to say." Diane raised an eyebrow, unsure if it was a compliment or a critique. And? "I think you were right," Mia said, her tone earnest. "It does feel like a lot of change all at once. But I also think Evelyn's right. There's room for us to grow." Diane studied Mia for a moment, then sighed. "You're braver than I was when I started out," she said. "I used to believe in this job the way you do. Somewhere along the line, I just got tired." Mia nodded. "I get that. But maybe this is our chance to believe in it again." Diane didn't respond right away, but her expression softened. Elsewhere, Lauren and Grace were preparing for another flight. The two had been paired together regularly since their pivotal flight with Evelyn, and their teamwork had only improved. "Have you noticed how different things feel?" Grace asked as they loaded supplies into the galley. Lauren glanced at her, curious. "Different how?" "I don't know," Grace said, shrugging. "Lighter. Like people are actually trying to be kinder?" Lauren chuckled. "It's amazing what a little accountability can do." As they worked, Tom passed by, pausing at the galley door. "You two look busy," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "We're getting ready for the rush," Lauren replied. Tom hesitated, then leaned against the doorframe. "I wanted to say, I saw how you handled that turbulence last week. You both did a great job." Grace blinked in surprise. "Thanks, Tom. That means a lot." Tom nodded, then added, "I still think some of this initiative stuff is over the top, but maybe it's not all bad." Lauren smiled faintly. "Baby steps, huh?" Tom smirked. "Something like that." Back at headquarters, Evelyn was reviewing updates in her office when Robert entered with a knowing look. "You're going to want to see this," he said, handing her a tablet. Evelyn took the device and scanned the screen. It was an internal newsletter featuring a story from a flight attendant who had recently attended one of the training workshops. The story detailed an interaction with a nervous passenger who had nearly missed their flight due to a misunderstanding at security. Instead of brushing the passenger off, the attendant took the time to listen, reassure them, and ensure they boarded safely. The article ended with the attendant writing, "This wasn't just about following the rules. It was about showing someone that they mattered. And for the first time in years, I felt proud of what I do." Evelyn smiled. "This is exactly what I hoped for." Robert nodded. "It's one story, but it's a start." Evelyn set the tablet down, her mind already racing. "We need to amplify this," she said. "Stories like this can inspire others to see the impact of their work." "I'll make sure it gets shared across the company," Robert said. "Good," Evelyn replied. "And keep me updated on the focus groups. I want to know if there's any progress with the skeptics." The next week, Diane found herself on a flight with Mia. As they prepared for takeoff, Diane noticed a passenger struggling to stow their oversized bag in the overhead compartment. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. "Let me help you with that," she said, her voice kind. The passenger smiled gratefully. "Thank you so much. I didn't think it would be this heavy." Diane lifted the bag with ease and secured it in the compartment. "No problem at all," she said. As she returned to the galley, Mia gave her a knowing look. "That was nice of you." Diane shrugged. "It's just part of the job." "Maybe," Mia said, "but it makes a difference." Diane didn't respond, but the faintest smile tugged at her lips. Later that evening, Diane sat in the crew lounge, scrolling through her phone. She stumbled across the internal newsletter featuring the story Evelyn had shared. As she read, something shifted in her perspective. She thought back to her own early days as a flight attendant, when she'd gone out of her way to make passengers feel welcome. Somewhere along the way, she had let fatigue and routine overshadow her passion for the job. Closing the article, Diane took a deep breath. Maybe it wasn't too late to reclaim that part of herself. Back in her office, Evelyn received another report from Robert. "Feedback from the focus groups is improving," he said. "Even some of the skeptics are starting to come around." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. "The tide is turning," she said. "Now, we just have to keep it going." Robert nodded. "What's next?" Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "Next, we show them how far this can take us." Evelyn Carter walked into the meeting room, her steps deliberate and calm. A small group of employees sat at the table, their expressions ranging from uneasy to defiant. These were some of the most vocal skeptics of the Respect Above All initiative, and Evelyn had called this meeting to hear their concerns directly. "Thank you all for being here," Evelyn began, taking a seat at the head of the table. She set aside her tablet, signaling her full attention. "I know you have reservations about the changes we've implemented, and I want to understand them. Let's start with this. What about the initiative feels most difficult to you?" The group exchanged hesitant glances until Diane, now feeling more confident in her evolving perspective, broke the silence. "It's not that the initiative is bad," she began carefully. It's a lot to take in all at once. For some of us, it feels like our years of experience don't matter anymore." Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "I hear you. Change, especially when it challenges long-standing habits, can feel like it devalues what you've already built. But that's not the intention." Tom leaned forward, his arms crossed. "Then what is the intention?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Because to some of us, it feels like we're being told we weren't good enough before." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "The intention is to raise the standard for everyone, not because you weren't good enough, but because we can all be better, myself included." Tom's expression softened slightly, but he still looked skeptical. Evelyn continued, her tone steady. "Let me tell you a story. When I first started in this industry, I worked behind the scenes in operations. One day, I watched as a gate agent stayed late to help a stranded family. The look on that family's faces, the gratitude they felt, it reminded me why I wanted to be part of this business. But years later, when I started flying regularly, I noticed something. Not every passenger got that same experience. Some were treated like problems to be solved, not people to be helped. And sometimes, even the best employees fell into that pattern, not because they didn't care, but because they were tired, stressed, or simply used to doing things a certain way. That's when I realized, if we don't create a culture that actively supports kindness and respect, we risk losing what makes this industry special." The room was silent, her words landing heavily. Diane finally spoke, her voice softer. "I think I understand what you're saying. But what happens to those of us who are struggling to keep up? Not everyone adapts as quickly as others." Evelyn's gaze softened. "Diane, this initiative isn't about perfection. It's about progress. It's about giving everyone the tools and support they need to succeed. If you're struggling, that's not a failure. It's an opportunity for us to help." Tom leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "I guess I've been looking at this the wrong way," he admitted. "I was so focused on what I might lose, I didn't see what we all stand to gain." As the meeting continued, the atmosphere shifted. Evelyn listened patiently to each concern, addressing them with a mix of honesty and encouragement. By the end, the group seemed less resistant, if not entirely convinced. "Thank you for sharing your thoughts today," Evelyn said as she stood. "I know this isn't easy, but I appreciate your willingness to have this conversation." My door is always open if you want to talk more." The employees nodded, some offering hesitant smiles as they left the room. Later that evening, Diane and Tom found themselves walking through the airport together. "Do you think she really meant all that?" Tom asked. Diane considered the question. "Yeah," she said finally. "I do. She didn't have to meet with us, but she did. And she didn't make us feel small for having doubts." Tom nodded slowly. Maybe this whole thing isn't just about corporate image after all. The next day, Evelyn received an email from Diane. "Miss Carter, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to meet with us yesterday. It helped me see things in a new light. I've been in this job a long time, and I've seen a lot of changes come and go. But this one feels different because it feels real. I'm still working on adjusting, but I wanted you to know that I'm on board now. If there's any way I can help others see what I'm starting to see, let me know." Evelyn smiled as she read the email, her resolve strengthening. A month later, the airline held a company-wide town hall to celebrate the progress of the initiative. Employees from across the organization shared stories of how the program had impacted their work. Diane spoke about her journey from skepticism to belief, earning applause from her peers. Lauren and Grace, seated in the front row, exchanged a proud glance. When it was Evelyn's turn to speak, she stood before the crowd with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through every challenge. "This initiative began as an idea," she said, "a vision of what our airline could be, but it's become something more. It's become a reflection of who we are and who we're striving to be. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But every act of kindness, every moment of respect, creates a ripple, and those ripples become waves. Together, we're building something bigger than any one of us. This isn't just about our airline. It's about setting an example for an entire industry, and I believe we're up to the challenge." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the hall. As Evelyn stepped off the stage, Robert approached her with a grin. "Looks like you've won them over." Evelyn smiled, her gaze scanning the crowd. "It's not about winning them over," she said. "It's about giving them something worth believing in." As Evelyn's journey shows, change isn't easy, but it's always worth striving for. Her commitment to kindness, respect, and leadership transformed not only an airline, but the lives of countless people within it. If you believe in the power of respect and leadership to inspire change, let Evelyn's story remind you that small actions can create ripples that lead to waves of transformation. Don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay updated with more tales of resilience, leadership, and the impact of human kindness. Let us know in the comments, what's one moment of kindness or leadership that inspired you? We'd love to hear your stories. Thank you for watching, and remember, respect truly rises above all.